in the smart city space. So that's why we've been bringing national speakers to this Texas Smart City series, because there's lots of good things going on around the country. And today we are super excited to have Ruthbea Yesner here from IDC. She's the VP of several areas, but one of them includes smart cities. So she has spoken at the Texas Smart City Summit before. Super happy to have her here. We'll turn it over to her in just a second, but I wanted to remind you, we do have talks in April and May coming up. Jessica, did you want to say something?
Jen's going to do the official Ruthbea introduction to you.
Okay, yes. So we have talks on the Texas Smart City series coming up from Steve Steinberg of IOLAP and Responsum AI. And on May 12th, Jen Sanders is actually going to speak from the Dallas Innovation Alliance. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen to introduce our speaker.
Hi, thanks so much. And great to be here with you. It's a great crowd, which doesn't surprise me given how amazing Ruthbea is. And it's a challenge to introduce Ruthbea because she's doing so much great work, has done so much great work, and is one of the most brilliant and thoughtful and inclusive women that I know. We met really early in my smart city journey and have learned such a great deal from her. You know, as the VP of Government Insights, you know, she manages both the US federal as well as the global smart cities practice. So her ability to have this visibility, you know, globally and be able to share those learnings and that research is just such a gift to the industry and certainly for me. And also love that she is a great champion of women, and so have really had a great opportunity there, and just think the world of her. And I can't wait to hear the updates and keep learning from her. So Ruthbea, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, that was a very lovely introduction. I'm really happy to talk to all of you today. I will share my screen in a minute. I will say that I don't know if I'm the furthest, but I am joining you from New Hampshire. And I had a little bit of a super fast crisis this week where we had some things happen in our apartment and we had to move family and dog really fast. So I actually found a place that would take us on a farm in New Hampshire. So I'm calling you from one of their spare guest rooms that they have loaned me to do the presentation. That's been interesting. And I guess it just goes to show the flexibility and you know, the current nature of life with our hybrid workforce, hybrid living. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and let me know when you see this. Looks good. Is it in slideshow mode for you guys? Let's see.
It's not in slideshow mode yet, but the slides.
Okay, there we go.
Perfect, exactly.
All right, great. So I should mention that if I have connectivity issues, because I'm using my phone hotspot, I might go off camera so that I'll just be talking, but I think that'll be fine. So the title of this talk is Building Towards the Future City While Operating During Budget Shortfalls. I will say, I think this is obviously a really important topic and also a massive, massive topic. There are so many things that I went sort of down these paths on. Oh, cloud migrations, managing technical debt, resiliency. I had like 64 slides. It was ridiculous. So I will just tell you how I tried to organize this. And I look forward to a lot of follow-up conversations if we want to have them, because I just think in 40 minutes that we can only talk about so much. So I'll tell you how I structured things, which was really trying to think about this. Basically, what are we trying to do? We talk about smart cities and communities. Let's revisit what is the whole point of this conversation and what are we trying to do? Because I think when you're talking about technology and you're talking about municipal government and you're talking about financial constraints or uncertainty, you always have to start with the outcomes you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to do. So a couple minutes just revisiting what we think the promise of smart cities and communities are. And then looking a little bit at where are we now? Because obviously 2020 did shift priorities and thinking, and I think constituent expectations and budgets and all sorts of things. So where are we now? That will help us think about some decisions that you all probably are facing. And then the second is, what do we need to think about as we make decisions now for the future? So I'm always a fan of, you have to know what's coming so you can make good decisions now. So I spend a while talking about these future trends and the considerations around scaling impact. If you were in the last Smart City presentation, when there was sort of a whole day of web event, maybe a couple slides are going to be familiar to you. And as I know, I see a lot of friends that I know from other places, you will probably see slides that are familiar to you. And that's okay, because we're kind of revisiting and talking about what's important. The other thing that was really interesting in thinking about this is we talked about budget shortfall, but actually it may be more financial uncertainty than budget shortfall, right? So we don't actually know what's going to happen with the Rescue Act. I know that we're sort of waiting for things to finalize before we really dive into it. It could be that there is money, right? It could be that there's some opportunity there. So I think we're dealing with more the to be determined state rather than a definitive, we have some sort of shortfall. Everybody, there is shortfall and there is constraints, of course, but I think the magnitude of some of these, we're not sure how much they might be offset. And I will say that I don't think I can see the chat anymore when I'm sharing full screen. So I may just stop at the end of each section and see if there's any big questions. If I don't know how you, Jessica, if you think that would work, or do you just want me to keep going and we'll talk at the end?
We're going to do Q&A at the end. So I wouldn't want to interrupt your flow. We just need to make sure that about 12:45, 12:50, we stop for some questions.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to talk a little bit about what the promise of smart cities is because there was a lot of ruminations, and there's always been a ton of discussion about the term smart cities. In the beginning it was, oh, well, what am I, a dumb city? And what does that really mean? And we're going to call ourselves a learning city, and we're going to be a digital city. And I have always been saying, it doesn't really matter. The smart thing was just like saying Kleenex, right? We're just trying to bundle a complex topic into a couple words. And if you're not a smart city, maybe you're a traditional city. But I think over 2020, when people's focus shifted, there was a lot of discussion around, is smart cities over? And I think that that's because people have become too embedded in thinking about smart cities as the Internet of Things. It's never been just the Internet of Things. You're talking about an entire city. We're talking about all the technologies, the ERP, the middleware, DevOps, everything, right, around the promise of technology modernization to deliver on outcomes that are important to urban areas. So I think what happened is people got very focused on smart cities means the Internet of Things, and I have never believed that that's the case. So that's my context here, which is we know technology is going to be embedded and essential for municipal operations. So that is what we mean by smart cities, which is just in terms of embracing that change. So, and I think what we talk about is in terms of sort of one framework for outcomes is how we deliver on sort of this ethic framework, which is marrying the constituent priorities with government priorities to deliver what we call the ethic, which is efficient, trusted, highly responsive, inclusive, and convenient government. So that's sort of one way of thinking about the promise of smart cities, which is looking at digital transformation in municipalities and being able to deliver on what the constituent priorities are, right? Cost effectiveness, being transparent, understanding their privacy, having lots of options for access, having it be equitable, omni-channel, et cetera. And then a lot of the government priorities, which are really on, cost efficiencies, productivity, being compliant, dealing with lots of, old legacy systems and silos and all those other things. So how we bring them together, I think, is one big area of the promise of smart cities. And then I just wanted to sort of revisit what we mean by smart city and community, which is that it is focused on outcomes, not on the technology. So again, not focused on the IoT and IoT specifically, but focused on how we use technologies for outcomes, and specifically with a wrapper around people and process. So how we think about engaging the community, how we think of developing a partnership ecosystem, how we manage risk and innovation to catalyze this digital transformation. And that of course involves using emerging technologies, but it's many, many, many technologies. So I think we can't pigeonhole ourselves to only thinking it's certain technologies. And at IDC, our practice includes public safety. So we have a dedicated public safety research practice and transportation research practice. So sometimes people separate those out, but actually we include kind of everything that comes under City Hall or your mayor's, the whole package. We don't, even a lot of times public safety IT is separate. We include everything that's sort of happening in that environment, though we separate out education because that tends to have its own sort of management and ownership and things like that. So when we're thinking about sort of the impact on, the technology impact on digital transformation, and we're talking about large scale change, because that's what transformation means, we also want to make sure that we know that the promise of smart city isn't going to happen immediately, and that it's really about slow, steady, and incremental progress, right? So we're trying to deliver on these outcomes. We're using technology to do so. We're doing it in a way that government works, which is slow and steady and incremental. And we're looking at some new priorities, which I think today involves considering how you manage a hybrid workforce and how you manage the return to work process and who's returning to work. Really thinking about curating needed talent and IT talent around monetizing and digitizing government. And also how we manage this change and innovation in the context of risk and resiliency and financial uncertainty. So trying things new, thinking about how we can be digitally resilient, right? Agile, flexible, secure, how that ties to physical resilience, et cetera. And I would just say that we're just still grappling with the age-old issues that have sort of been really challenging for cities for a really long time, right? So there's never enough money, but we're seeing some of these things, I think, be more emphasized or more highlighted or actually become worse throughout the pandemic. So obviously the budget pressures and uncertainty have been really heightened. We've seen a lot of increased inequality with some folks really weathering the pandemic very well, companies weathering it very well, having record years, and then a lot of people obviously unemployed and really under pressure. So an increased bifurcated or different kind of response and experience of people that are living in cities. And that's driving how we think about what we're doing, right? Also, this idea that resiliency and the talk of resiliency extends beyond the physical. So I think a lot of times we talked about resiliency within water management or, earthquakes or, how you're going to keep your physical systems resilient in the face of a lot of challenges we're having, maybe with severe weather or things like that, which I think many in Texas obviously know. But resiliency really does expand beyond the physical as technology is really embedded in our processes. I think we all know this. So we have to start to think about what digital resiliency means and how digital resiliency is also supporting physical resiliency as these things become more tied together. And then I think the challenges we all know, we have to do cost control. We have to manage new workflows as things get digitized, as with hybrid working. We have to think about meeting really new desires by constituents, which I think as a driver became much more important and much more highlighted during COVID. We've done many consumer surveys, which really do show, to no surprise, because I'm sure we all feel the same way, that people really don't want to go into a municipal office to do paperwork. They really want to continue a lot of this remote and contactless experience and through devices for the most part, right? And so that really leads to the question of how municipalities can cope with that and respond to that. And that also has a challenge related to skills shortages. So continuing on this discussion around, so what's the promise of smart cities? We have seen when we ask municipal governments about benefits from digital transformation efforts, we have seen them say that there are actual concrete results. So a third say there's cost efficiencies, better employee retention and innovation, higher employee satisfaction, productivity improvements. So I think that's one promise that we're aiming towards for smart cities, which is all these basic business things that you're trying to do to be, efficient and productive. These are supportive efforts to that. And then secondarily, I think, we also start to see sort of the promise of these, technologies as they get embedded in other physical systems and promise some results. And I wanted to spend a moment on this slide because really the reality is that there is scarce information to prove any of this. And it is something that we've been working on quite a bit, and it's just not that easy. You have to go sort of use case by use case, and there's different systems. And in general, municipalities don't necessarily have that information so that they can compare to what was happening before to now. So one of the things we've seen is that when we do have results, yes, they are showing ROI and they are showing promise, but it is very hard to find it, and and we need more of it. I will say secondarily that when we show these examples, these are just some, right? There's a lot of embedded challenges in these. So for example, there's a lot of talk about connected lighting and outdoor lighting. And then, when you start to dig, well, that only really helps you if your lights are metered or if you own your lights, right? Similarly with, smart buildings, it really depends on how much real estate you have. And maybe that changes with hybrid workforce. With smart parking, if you're changing to different models and you're trying to do and reduce urban congestion, what does that mean about investing in parking? And especially as we've seen with the pandemic, if people aren't traveling the same way they are, and they're not going to return to traveling the same way they did with cars. So I think all of these, we really have to look underneath the sheets to see not only can we start to really measure better these results, but also can we really make sure that the results are tied to actually how cities operate and how you can really see those benefits, because sometimes, it doesn't work for everybody. And I would say it's a scaling issue, which we'll talk about quite a bit later, in that these are not effective solutions if you do them for one neighborhood. They're only effective if you do them for really large swaths and areas. And that goes back to the point of how do we scale these things? Because we're not seeing the promise by doing small pilots that are very localized, because you don't see the impact in the same way and what's promised. So the question really becomes, how do we scale some of these things, especially when we're dealing with these, financial uncertainty? Okay, so where are we now? This is really just to take a snapshot of sort of the current issues. And I just put this in here. I'm not going to read some of these slides. I will say are text heavy. I'm not going to read all of them. But I was really interested in the Menino survey of mayors that happens each year that came out in 2020. And I felt like from the surveys that we had done, we surveyed 2,000 US folks. We did a smart cities and communities survey of city leaders. It really was reflective of some of the general sentiment. And that chart on the side is just Texas unemployment statistics. So we can kind of get relative impact compared to 2008 and sort of see where we're at. So the mayors are really saying that there is going to be permanent behavior change. So where we are now is that there are going to be differences between pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And for example, 90% of mayors say that post-vaccine, they believe their residents will still work from home more. And so that has a lot of implications around connectivity and what happens within the cities themselves. 60% agree that downtown office buildings will become less desirable. And there's a lot of discussion in this report around whether people will return to the same level of entertainment and other types of things. And 36% that small businesses that close due to COVID will quickly be replaced by new ones. So we can see that there's some pessimism here, right? There's going to be changes and the recovery is going to take quite a bit of time. At the same time, the pandemic has kind of shone a light on what is possible, which is that governments can actually, cities can actually stand up services pretty quickly. They can be innovative. They can manage under crisis incredibly well, which we've seen with the pandemic. I mean, there's been lots of really, really good things that happened. And so that's really reflected too in this idea that we've learned a lot in 2020, and that's going to lead to more opportunities for people in the future in cities. And then again, we go back to sort of federal funding and state funding and what's going to happen there. And that's the uncertainty, right? So 13% of mayors, so a very small, pretty small percent, believe that there was enough CARES Act money for small businesses in their cities. And 46% there was a large gap between what was available and what was needed just in general. So I think that really ties us quite a bit to what's happening with federal policy. And that also then impacts what projects will go ahead, what projects will be prioritized, and what needs to happen, within the departments and the CIOs and the IT department. And then again, when we survey the cities, we see that they're not really out of the crisis. So this is a result of government respondents, and we sort of take the economic situation, which is below, and we sort of ask them, where would you see yourself in terms of, are you still really focused on business continuity? Are you still really focused? Are you moving towards targeted investments in the future? And we kind of phased those kind of around sort of where we thought economic recovery was. So interestingly enough, a lot of folks are still really feeling like they're in this crisis of business continuity, while a good chunk are now, which is very different from the beginning of the year, feeling like they're moving to the next normal. So I think we see some cities that were much better prepared to handle what happened. They'd already started some modernization efforts, and they are, I think, shifting a little more towards the future view, whereas the majority of cities are really focused on how we manage costs, how we maintain our services, how we maintain our resiliency. And so the other thing it's interesting to look at, another view of where we are now, is based on our sort of smart city maturity model. So back in 2013, I started to develop a way of thinking about how cities might mature around this idea of smart cities. And we're on V3.0, right, for this, but the core has remained basically fairly steady in terms of how we look at the maturity. And so we've been able to, over time, survey US cities and kind of see where they're going. And we did a survey in late 2020 in September and through the fall. And we basically saw that in many of these areas, which I'll talk about what they are, cities in the purple is 2020 have made a lot of movement in maturity. So they are no longer in this ad hoc stage, which is all the way on one side, which is the earliest stage, and these are progressive, right? So you go ad hoc, opportunistic, repeatable to optimize. So ad hoc was this really like department-based, small initiatives, no leadership, no strategy type of approach to smart city initiatives. Opportunistic was a little more, developing some policies, thinking about coordination, having some more senior leadership, bringing people together. And repeatable is really this, where there's strategic planning. We've seen lots of smart city plans tied to IT plans, tied to city plans. We've seen more policies developed around specific technologies. And so that's really when, and we have also started to see cities consider how they could leverage infrastructure for multiple use cases. So that's sort of that big repeatable phase. So we really do see in terms of where we are now, that there has been a tremendous amount of movement over the past, 8 or 9 years for cities and counties, even if it has been incremental over time. And so this is just sort of what's under the hood in terms of those stages, in terms of what we measure. So when we look at that ad hoc through optimized, we look at key best practice areas that we believe are important to develop smart city initiatives. And as you can see, a lot of them are actually the soft wrapper around technology and data. So vision and culture and process, all these things, as we know in government, are incredibly important. You can't do anything without knowing, having, procurement compliance. You can't do anything without understanding, having leadership involved, involving budgeting and the vision stage. So what we say is, these are sort of the key best practice areas that you need to be considering, and they all really need to be addressed and worked together for effective initiatives. So when we say that cities are sort of in repeatable stages, that means that within each of these, because we ask about each of these, they are in what we consider that repeatable stage within each of these subdimensions. And I think that's incredibly interesting. I will also say that we did add some new areas. We haven't changed the core, but we did add some new areas to look at, which I think is reflective of what's happening in smart cities today. So we added digital skills to vision to really start to hone down on what's happening with digital skills. We added digital inclusion. We broke out sort of digital inclusion and transparency and culture. We added procurement to process, separate from sort of partnership ecosystems and governance and organizational structure, really focused on that procurement process. And then within data, we did a little, we basically broke out a couple things. We had, I think, data sharing and privacy may have been together, and so we broke them out into a lot of different areas around data. Okay, so that's sort of the promise of future cities. I think looking at digital transformation across all technologies, where we are now is actually in a very good shape in terms of maturity and movement, but in a new context due to 2020 and everything that's happened, and the new priorities that I think are coming forward. So I think then the question is, what's coming and how do we plan what we're doing now to ensure that we're ready for the future? Which, when we talk about future, sometimes these things spring up on us, right? People might have had very long plans around, like in education, remote learning, 10-year plans to do remote and hybrid learning. They got condensed into, 6 months. And that could easily happen, I think, with cities as well. We see that in crises, right? So the drivers, when we think about what are the future trends, and I think I've kind of alluded to these going forward, is when we do our predictions every year, we really think of what are the macro drivers impacting smart cities. And I think, again, what's the next normal around resiliency in terms of business and operating models? How are we thinking about data, right? Data and insights, but also data privacy, security. What are we doing, especially with geopolitical risk, right? We have a lot of tension between cities and states in the US. We have a lot of tension within constituents. So how are we managing constituent engagement and constituent needs in a fairly tense environment, to be frank, I think? How are we thinking about redefining customer? It should be consumer engagement, constituent engagement. How is it safe and secure and sustainable? How are we addressing the imperative of connectivity and that sort of homework gap, which could also be a workforce gap if people don't have the proper connectivity in home. How are we thinking about the return to work and hybrid workforce? And how are we dealing with the impact of weather events and the scarcity of resources? And I'll just make a point, whereas I think a lot of these things become blended. So I was on a recent workshop with some folks who were looking at broad scale military security. And they were making the point that when we have severe weather events, that is often when bad actors internationally do misinformation campaigns. And so because we can use data so well to predict severe weather, they're able to actually plan ahead to do destabilization or misinformation campaigns, often referring to what's happening in cities and what the response is, because they know there's going to be a crisis and people are going to be more vulnerable and there's going to be these issues. So I think we have to think about all these things together within how data is used, how risk is thought of, how, you know, climate may be impacting this, because they all could come to a head in certain examples. So anyway, I showed this before in my last talk. This is just really asking governments, you know, where do you think things will permanently be changed? So where do we know? And again, customer engagement, it's going to be online. It's got to be more self-service, business continuity, work from home. I think we all know this. I've kind of said them again and again, but just to reiterate, these are sort of the key top of mind things that I think we need to be thinking about as priorities, which may be new priorities now, right? That they weren't before. And so when we think about ways to think about things over the next 5 years, and so thinking about how you set things up now, now I think we're definitely thinking about the hybrid workforce. We're thinking about security from a lot of different edge devices and work from home. And we're thinking about more automation around, you know, sort of supplementing digital skills with, especially around AI and machine learning. And then the near term, thinking about what's going to happen with this information once we add on sort of other visualization layers, and we think about how we can really use digital space planning and this information to plan and speed recovery. And how we can really think about having more dedicated staff to drive innovation in cities. So we're seeing a lot of that smart city movement happening through an innovation office or an innovation lead. They don't often have funding. They're more like a connector of people, but how are they really having impact and helping scale? I think it's a question, given how a lot of cities have set up sort of the Smart City Initiative. And then longer term, how are we going to scale infrastructure? I think is just one of the big questions. How we're going to get that kind of different types of networks that we need, how we're going to have more automation to do remote management, which is going to both help resiliency and cause some vulnerabilities, and how we're really going to start to think about new services around constituents, which are going to blend digital and physical experiences in new ways. So I think these are all things we really need to be prepared for in the future. I'm going to whip through the next little bit, and I hate that I'm in slideshow because I can't see anybody, and I don't know if everyone's even there or sleeping. So I hope you're still with me. I, only have about 10 more minutes, so I'm going to kind of scoot through these because I think we want to spend most of our time talking towards the end. So what I did here was really just mention a few of these predictions and things that I think are happening now that we need to think about. One of them is around this idea of even simple AI or things that are becoming embedded and what's happening around security and malware and all sorts of ransomware attacks. And so how we need to start to think of the tools we can use to respond to these. And if you can't incorporate sort of these AI ML responses natively, you're going to have some workarounds and customization. That itself will introduce fragility. And so what do we do here? We know these attacks are going to continue to occur. We know we're going to continue to build out a lot of these edge capabilities. We know there's sort of a talent crunch. And so we need to really think about how we can plan and mitigate these risks, how we can find the talent that can deal with this, how we can automate some of this so that we don't always have to rely on hiring the right people if we can't find them and there's not enough of them for government. And obviously we have to design secure networks. And so we see that this is a priority and this is happening. This was from 2019. We think this is still the trend. We haven't redone this specific survey, but the focus really does need to be around security going forward in terms of investment. And I think it really needs to go into some sophistication around dealing with data better. And that includes, really integrating data and figuring how we leverage it in maybe very old systems, and put some things, services on top of those, so that we can really start to glean some information and make some better decisions, which is one of the promises of smart cities. The other prediction, I know I'm kind of going fast here, is around this idea around the hybrid workplace and workforce, which I think is a very important thing that we're dealing with right now. What we've basically seen, and maybe you've seen it in your own cities, is that people, at least I just did a recent roundtable about this, 30%, 35% of people really want to stay from home forever. 30%, really want to do something hybrid, and some want to return to work. And so I think the question becomes how we are really thinking about a hybrid workplace, and who needs to come back. So is it somebody who's working on a network? Is it, your IT service desk folk? Maybe they need to come back. Who doesn't need to come back? And what does that imply for, how you set up your IT, how you set up these workers, and how you manage sort of the cultural implications of not having people who maybe know each other or work together regularly. So I think really thinking right now about sort of the return to work, who returns, how you have people return, I'll talk about a little more, is something that's really important to think about. And this was sort of the response we asked of government folks. The dark blue is what's happening now, sort of in the COVID environment. I think this was taken in October. So most people, 40% were mainly working from home. About equally, some were working in a physical office, and then some were in the field. And then post-vaccine, there's a lot of expectations that people are going to return. Maybe it's going to go 50% will be working and returned, but a good chunk, almost 30%, may still be primarily working from home. And the last thing I just wanted to talk about was how much we're having this sort of blended reality of digital and physical, and how we start to manage this workflow, right? Because it ultimately is all about the fact that at this point, there's a lot of breaks in workflow in city government, right? There might be a manual process, or an Excel file gets emailed to somebody, or that someone has to enter something. There might be things that need to be printed to be signed. And I think for constituents, that's really not the way they want to go. And so when we see the example of, let's say, smart parking, right, what they really want is use their mobile app to find, where there are parking spaces, and find what's happening with traffic flow, park. Maybe they use Quarters, which is a physical, but maybe they use a mobile app to pay for their parking. And then they refresh that parking from outside. Meanwhile, physically, somebody comes and tickets them, and they have a physical ticket, but then they go online to a system to pay that ticket. So I think that's one example. We start to see all the examples being like that. And so how does that really impact how we set up the way that these systems are working? And I think, we saw that there was not much preparation in terms of really having things go remote and contactless. Services basically just stopped in many cases because there was no way without an in-person visit or paper for a lot of tasks to be done within municipal government. Maybe you needed to go to the county courthouse, maybe you needed a name change, maybe whatever might have happened, we really can't do that effectively all the time online. And we need to think about that, because that's a piece of resiliency, and it's a piece of what the constituents wants, and it's probably ultimately going to be much more cost effective and reduce a lot of errors. So we really need to think about that as we're going forward from what we learned in 2020, and see where there's high need, high process areas are, and think about what we can do easily to digitize, well, easily I say, but what we can do to digitize those. And I think I just put some things here saying, 18% of constituents did things digitally that they didn't ever do, they always did in person, and at least a third would prefer that these be through digital channels. I did this in September. I really can't believe it's only 30%. So I think when we would do it again, even as we're coming out of maybe COVID and people are getting vaccinated, I think we'll find that a lot of people really want to continue doing things through digital channels. So then we go to the question of scaling and how we actually get through this. And in 5 minutes, so we'll still have a couple minutes to chat. This is just showing a lot of different use for smart city initiatives and thinking about them in terms of time horizons. And the main point of this slide is that all IT, whether it's in the IT department or managed in a separate department, public works or transportation, all these systems, all this IT strategy and planning for initiatives, for priorities over time need to be tied to your citywide or countywide mission and to a smart city mission. So I think what we really see is that we need a blending of strategies and make sure that these things are tied together. We've seen a lot of movement here where things are being really connected, but not always, and especially not always across departments. And so I think we really need to take that enterprise view, because the other thing that this is showing is that things are related to each other. And there can be infrastructure that is leveraged across use cases. And the thing that really gets away and gets in the way of leveraging those is when they cross departments. And maybe they cross funding streams, and they cross leadership, and they cross maybe different back-end systems. So we're trying to obviously modernize systems and I think consolidate some of these systems. So I think there's a lot of discussion around governance and policy and how these things can be effectively leveraged, which really goes beyond maybe the technology. But I think it's just mostly important to say we still need that strategic piece to try to get a whole view, even if you're focused on your own department. You know, there has to be some motivation to look and really think about how you can scale things and share resources across departments. I'm not saying it's easy, but I really do think that it's an important path forward. I think the other thing is really looking at what's happening with the central network infrastructure and bandwidth. You know, I said this wasn't all about IoT, but IoT is not the only thing that is supported by the network. So we really need to consider how we scale that kind of infrastructure, and knowing that it's going to be heterogeneous, right? Like you're not going to have the same environment or use the same, you know, types of Wi-Fi, wireless, LoRaWAN, this, that, and the other, depending on the use case. So you're going to have lots of different choices, and how you make those choices is very important. But the point is that you need to continue to be thinking about how to build out your network. And we've seen that part of this is really challenged by the cost, and that really sometimes prohibits scaling the deployment. Sometimes it's also skills, which we didn't ask here because this was technical, but one of the other key things when we ask it, and we talk about skills, is that there's a lack of skills to be able to do things. So finally, thinking about, I think, what we need to really think about now going forward in time of financial uncertainty, which is a lot around talent management and workforce management. So one of the things I think we all know is that it's really hard to find some digital skills and to hire for those digital skills. But we know that there's a lot of new things happening, and we need to hire, and cities need those skills, and we need to reskill and upskill. There's a lot of opportunity for doing that with current staff. And instead of looking outside all the time, really looking at who internally would be a great candidate to learn new things and to be that person. And it doesn't matter what their age is. It doesn't matter, even their technical skills. You can teach a lot of these things. And so, we've seen some municipalities look at internal career apprenticeship programs. So really taking different staff, giving them on-the-job experience, giving them credentials, giving them a path to move up, and that really can solve some of the skills shortage challenges. The other thing, which cities have been doing a long time, which is alliances with local colleges and universities and hiring and training new graduates. Sometimes the complaint there is that they're short-lived, but I think it doesn't matter. Get in new folks with new skills, train them up. You keep them for 3 to 5 years, great. They go out in the community, they're trained, it's a community service, but also they are able to really give you some, I think, fresh perspectives and new skills when they come in. And then I think finally, we really need to think about the hybrid return to the workplace and what implications are there. So what are the policies for remote work? How you are going to manage and support work-life balance as people do more remote work and they never sort of leave work. Maybe that is involving a totally new way of saying, you have to take your vacations or you have to spread them out because you really need people not to get burnt out and you really need them to take them. And that's not something you ever had to manage for before. I think we need to think about models for performance management as we are assuming that there's still going to be a lot of hybrid workers going forward. So how we think about new ways of managing folks and thinking about performance as people are in hybrid environments. And then finally, things, and these don't cost a lot, right? These are just processes and new ways of thinking. So this is also why I'm bringing them up, because they're really important right now. And I think the other thing is, what are you doing if your team is now all over the place? How do you onboard new people? How do you foster sort of still knowing each other and like working together and teamwork? And how do you foster sort of a culture if people are really never seeing each other in the same way in the office? And so I think these are new things to think about in terms of creative ways that we can really manage talent, but also manage a hybrid workforce. And then the last thing is, I think, really thinking about partnerships and innovations. If we're going to scale things effectively, we really need to figure out what the partnership models are. And we've been really focused on, okay, let's pilot and test and do some. Cities are a test bed and maybe they'll co-create or be, a first user of a product, and that's great. It doesn't scale. It doesn't give us the impact that we want. And what we really need is sustainable partnership models. So nobody has figured that out. I think that's something that we should think about doing, which is co-creating sustainable partnership models as opposed to co-creating products per se. I mentioned the Autonomy Institute because they're located, I think, in Austin, and they work with a lot of folks, and they are really dedicated, if you want to look them up, to thinking about new and sustainable partnership models. I think the same thing around monetization strategies. What are the ones that really work and how do we think about that? I think these things also they don't cost a lot, but we have to really start to track and understand what we're doing and have better data on when we invest. Do we really get out what we want? Can we track the outcome and the ROI? And then I think in the future way, really thinking about how we can plan for shifts in revenues. We experienced it now, right? There was no parking revenues happening. What if that continues because the city has a shift to try to reduce traffic, to go away from personal driving? What's the strategy to replace parking collections, as an example? So I think we have to really start to think about these partnership and value innovations as we go forward. And these are not things that cost anything, but they are things that could really drive value, derive unique products, derive unique efforts that could scale some of these things that need to scale. So, I'm going to skip this because we're way over, and just stop and open it up for the next 10 minutes to questions.
Thank you, Ruthbea. We appreciate it. If you could, yeah, great. I was going to ask you to stop sharing and say now we will take questions. I don't see, it was hard to track them in the chat because there were so many other comments, but we'll just open it up to the group at large and ask everybody to be respectful, try not to step on each other, et cetera. So let's go.
Yeah, I had a question. This is Ron Baker with IBM. I'm glad you ended on the slide you did about the different models there. We found a lot of the same difficulties over the years as well. The question I've got is, what I've not seen are, and I wonder if you have seen, business models that, sort of show these different areas. So let's use your parking as an example. right? Either the city can do their own application and hire the skills, as you mentioned, and there's a certain, cost factor associated with that and the benefit the city would get, right? And that's just one city, and there's a cost savings or a model or a new revenue source associated with that. An alternative to that is you move to software as a service. I'm going to distinguish that from just cloud. So you can run the first one on a cloud and you can save, let's say some small percentage of infrastructure cost. But by moving to SaaS, you might get a company that does parking solutions, and you might get, let's say, 200 or 300 cities that can all share that. Now the cost structure can be considerably less for each individual city. But what we found is the business model for a company to do that hasn't been lucrative enough, and we can't get 200 cities to agree on anything to make that possible, right? Have you seen any trend here in the promise of these cities moving more towards that kind of cloud hosted SaaS model where it's an operational expense, let's say on a low monthly bill, as opposed to them trying to do all their things in-house?
Yeah, and it's funny because I went down a huge cloud path in this discussion when I was thinking about cost savings, and it got way too much. And it was so I think there is a lot happening with cloud. I think we are seeing much more movement and investment, and a lot of folks recognizing the savings and some of the resiliency that they get from cloud. It seems to be, and it's interesting, I was just talking about this with IBM. It seems to be that there's mostly the movement and thinking about new applications that could be moved to the cloud, and then a real needing to think about existing, how you prioritize and figure out which existing systems or workloads need to be moved to the cloud. And some are not cloud ready. Some it doesn't make any sense to do so. So I don't know if I'm asking your business model question about 50 cities, but I think there is a whole piece of this, which is about cloud and moving to the cloud and moving to SaaS models. But it has much more to do with the migration strategy than it does with.
Yeah, and unfortunately, and we do a lot of that, obviously, right, with the hybrid cloud strategy. But those are, to me, those are infrastructure savings on your current platforms, right? And so that's nice, right? And those are good. They're not innovative, though, right? They're not changing the game to mobile applications, right? Where with and by SaaS I mean multi-tenant, where you can drive the cost factor down by orders of magnitude. And now you can start to look at, an advanced analytic or parking solution that's, less than $1,000 a month, right, per city, right? And to get to those prices, cities have to get more agreement. And I've just not seen any movement. And so nobody can put together a business plan to make it work is what we're finding.
Exactly. So that, I think, is where I'm talking about that partnership innovation, because these are the roadblocks that happens even within a city. So one of the movement I will say that we are seeing around this is with MPOs, so metropolitan transportation, regional authorities, where they're trying to understand what they could do around transportation across municipalities, because that's their remit. I don't know that anyone's implemented anything. Maybe Portland TriMet has done some things, but they're starting to try to think about it and how to bring different municipalities together to at least come to an agreement about what they would want to do and what's priorities to do. And then I think how to do it becomes a separate situation. But this is the limitation. It's a limitation even within a city. Right? I mean, you could talk about your streetlights and wanting to do something with your streetlights, and they could be Parks and Rec, Public Works, DOT. They all have different lighting management, central management systems. They can't actually figure out how to do something coordinated within the city. So this is exactly what I'm talking about partnership innovation. There isn't an answer. It has to be developed. I wish I had one. But I think it's complicated, and that's why I think so what I'm basically saying is we need to dedicate effort to it. We need to really co-create that innovation like we would a product.
Quick comment.
Let me actually, I need to stop it right there.
Yeah.
We are already at 12:59 and we always let everybody go. I really apologize. Ron, it's great to hear from you. You managed to get one question in that used up the whole Q&A time. Welcome back.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. And I'm sorry to everybody else, but we do try to end these on time. That's important to make sure that people know what they can count on here. We hope you will come back for the next month for our speaker who has got some smart city projects deployed in Texas. We are coming out of this pandemic. You can expect to hear about a new Texas Smart City Summit. You can expect to hear a lot more about projects that we're starting to ramp up behind the scenes. Certainly the pandemic has slowed down lots of things, including efforts to build smart cities in Texas and beyond. But things are ramping up and we hope to talk to you more soon. With that, I want to thank Ruthbea again. Thank you very much, Ruthbea. That was an action-packed hour. We've recorded this. We will make it available to folks. Again, apologies for lack of time for questions, but if you join at least the Austin Smart City Alliance Slack, and certainly anyone can join that, you don't have to be in Austin, we'll try to get questions answered that way. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.